Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Kirby. I'm the chair of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma. Welcome to the 2023 Scudder Oration on Trauma. This oration honors the legacy of Dr. Charles Locke Scudder, the founding chair of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma. One of the great privileges of serving as chair of the Committee on Trauma is the honor to introduce each year's Scudder Orator. And I'm extremely pleased this year to introduce Dr. Edward E. Cornwell III as the 2023 Scudder Orator. Dr. Cornwell currently serves as the LaSalle D. LaFalle Jr. Professor of Surgery and Director of the Clive Callender Outcomes Research Center at Howard University College of Medicine. He was born and raised in Washington, D.C. He attended Sinwell Friends School and then received his undergraduate education at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, followed by his medical degree from Howard University College of Medicine, where he graduated with honors and as class president in 1982. Dr. Cornwell received his surgical training at LA USC Medical Center, followed by a trauma and critical care fellowship at the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Services in Baltimore, Maryland. Following academic surgical appointments at both Howard University and the University of South Carolina, he was recruited to Johns Hopkins University, where he served as the chief of trauma from 1998 to 2008. He was then recruited back to Howard University as a surgeon-in-chief of Howard University Hospital and the LaSalle D. LaFalle Jr. Professor and Chairman at Howard University College of Medicine. Dr. Cornwell has served as the president of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons, president of the surgical section of the National Medical Association, chairman of TraumaNet of Maryland. He was a member of the Central Committee on Trauma for several years, serving in leadership roles as chair of the membership committee and as the inaugural chair of the advocacy committee. He is past secretary of the American College of Surgeons and was on the board of managers of the American Association for the Surgery of Trauma. He is currently president of the Southeastern Surgical Congress. Dr. Cornwell's career interest is in the prevention, treatment, and outcome disparities of traumatic injuries and their critical care sequelae. He has authored or co-authored over 310 articles and chapters and has given over 420 invited presentations in the field. He has delivered the name lecture or keynote address at over 55 institutions and conferences. He was selected as commencement speaker at the USC School of Medicine in 1996 and at the Howard University College of Medicine in 2002 and received the Distinguished Alumni Award from Howard University College of Medicine in 2014. Dr. Cornwell has received numerous awards and citations for his efforts in education, outreach, and violence prevention. He has received major teaching awards in every faculty position he has held. Dr. Cornwell has been a leading advocate for firearm injury prevention for many years, showing us by example how to move beyond the four walls of the hospital and work within the community on prevention efforts. He has worked tirelessly to address the culture of violence, encouraging our profession to develop our social consciousness, to go beyond just repairing what's injured, to getting involved in the social aspect of what we are treating. About Dr. Cornwell, one of his colleagues wrote, "There are many superlatives to describe Dr. Eddie Cornwell. Perhaps the most fitting is that which describes his dedication. He is dedicated to his family, to his patients, to justice, to those who have come before us in our surgical lineage, and most especially to those who follow us in training. He has had the roles of teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend. Most especially throughout all of this, he has always been a gentleman. He is a model of that to which we aspire." Members of the audience, please welcome your 2023 Scudder Orator in Trauma, Dr. Eddie Cornwell.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Kirby, my mother, the matriarch of the large Cornwell clan that's sitting here in the front row, her presence allows me to forego the usual task of telling her that you read that introduction in precisely the way she wrote it. So I want to thank you for that too kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I stand before you humbled for a privilege and an honor beyond measure. I've listened to over 30 Scudder orations during my career, and almost without exception, the orators begin by thanking the many people that led to them being at this place in this time. The frog on the wood post and many other sort of surrogates of thankfulness. And so I assigned myself a task of two things today. One is to celebrate some of the occurrences in my life of blessings that has me here. Many of my friends, colleagues, professional colleagues in this audience could be up here with me today. It's a pretty large stage, so in my mind and my heart, and literally, you all are up here with me. I also want to apologize in advance for the first-person references that's associated with someone who's had as many blessings as I have, but I'll offer no apologies for a positive spin in a world where our discourse with each other has grown more and more distracting, almost to the point of naivete, trying to make the case for you in these next 45 minutes that trauma care, with all of its imperfections, with all of its challenges, it's not for everybody, is indeed the vehicle, the barometer, and the yardstick for equal care in America. The lines of my life have fallen in great places. I didn't earn it, I didn't deserve it. That's kind of what I call a blessing. But these two people, my parents, are really the first and the enduring people to whom I pay tribute for me being here. Edward Cornwell Jr., my father, was born in Columbia, South Carolina. He was in Benedict College, a small college in South Carolina, in 1941 as a freshman when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. After that freshman year, he enlisted, as so many thousands of Americans did. The GI Bill, which created a middle class in America, served him well and helped him complete his undergraduate education. On Sunday night, we heard President Henry Ford tell a very American story. That story I've heard repeated many times of the many immigrants and immigrants' children who applied to medical school and surgical residency, and I'm here to give you the United States version of a very similar story. I stand before you with my 5 brothers and sisters as that generation, that first post-civil rights generation of 2 parents. My mother, who's sitting right before me here, grew up in Connecticut, went down to Florida A&M to college. That's unusual for a black woman born in 1927, but went home to the town of her grandparents, and she entered freshman year at Florida A&M with a 15-year-old by the name of LaSalle Lafall. He graduated in 3 years at the age of 18. She graduated in 4 years. In 1949, she comes to Washington, D.C. to work on the 1950 census. And in 1948, Dr. Lafall comes to Howard to be a freshman in medical school. My mother would meet my father on the campus of Howard University, and of their union was born 6 children, 5 of whom are here today. They were uninhibited, as were the immigrants that came to this country, those that came out of the segregated South, in their ambition for their children. It was all about education. And as I look at this 1983 40-year-old photo of my class, I'm standing on your far left behind my brother Michael, who's in the front row here. Michael was the youngest. 5 of the 6 of us were born in that 1946 to 1954 generation that we call the 1946 to 1964 generation that we call the baby boomers. And this represents my father receiving the Alumni Award at Howard University College of Medicine at the NMA meeting in Chicago in the summer of 1983. When I look at this photo, I think of all those tuitions he was paying. There's 2 Sidwell friends in there, 1 St. Albans, Brown undergrad, Yale undergrad, Tufts undergrad times 2, Spelman undergrad, Barnard and American University, 2 Howard University College of Medicine graduate degrees times 2, 2 Georgetown Law degrees, a business degree from the Wharton School of Business. That's incredible. Now, this was August of 1980. 83. We choose to remember this photo. That photo doesn't quite have the gleam in his eyes. He would be dead in 7 months of pancreatic cancer. My father had a 25-year practice in Washington, D.C., where he helped to train such residents and future college leaders such as Kathy Anderson and Tony Sadawi. But he lectured to the Howard medical students on pancreatic cancer, including myself on my third-year surgery rotation. I tried to keep that legacy alive as I lectured to my youngest brother, Michael. During that time after my father's death, my mother kept the legacy going. Sitting here with me today, of the 8 people in this, or 7, my brother David could not be with us. My sisters, Terry, Patty, and Brenda, the firstborn grandchild, Cheryl, my brother Michael, are all here with us today. Thank you all for being my rock, being the frame of reference that I carry to the challenging bedside issues that we see in trauma care. More about you all in a second. That legacy of teaching one in the family was continued. I tried to teach my brother Michael some important lessons of surgery, something about sleep when you can. Shout out to Doctors Feliciano and Grace Rosicki for their participation in the training of my brother Michael at Emory. Grace Rosicki was one of the early recipients of the Edward Cornwell Teaching Award, established at Washington Hospital Center upon my father's death. My son Michael had not met her until he, as an intern, walked into her office during his internship at Emory, and on her wall was that Edward Cornwell Teaching Award. You can't make this up. Michael walks in and says, "That's my father." And so all of these prepared me for my trip to LA County USC. The Harrises, Stephen Stain, my resident colleagues, had the opportunity to train at a very busy place, rich with trauma experience, under an academic professor, Dr. Arthur Donovan, who was a chair in the middle there looking at an X-ray. He was a chair from 1979 and 1991. Indeed, this represents nearly 60 years of leadership at LA County Hospital. On your right, his left, Dr. C.J. Byrne, his predecessor, and on his right, Dr. Leonard Rosoff, chairman at that large teaching hospital in the largest county in the country, allowed us to become expert in the selective management of perforated peptic ulcers, to engage our growing skills in surgical critical care management at an institution with a rich clinical base. A resident in the middle of the night in 1979 thought it was a good idea when a patient had a combined pancreatic and duodenal injury to do all of this surgery of vagotomy and antrectomy, a tube to decompress the duodenal stump, a prograde jejunostomy feeding tube, drainage of the duodenum and the pancreas. Doesn't demonstrate here a T-tube and a normal-sized common duct in an era where TPN had not yet taken complete hold, and a duodenal stump blowout carried approximately a 25% mortality. The attendings thought that was kind of a lot of surgery, but within 2 years, those 3 authors I just showed you published 12 such patients, the duodenal diverticulation operation, which brought that institution to my father's attention, and he suggested I consider LA County as a great place to train, and so it was. We stopped doing that operation. It gave way to the pyloric exclusion, but it gave us an appreciation for upper GI physiology. From there, I would go to shock trauma. Thank you, Dr. John Siegel, Phil Militello, Dr. Michael Dunham, Dr. Amin Ramsey, Dr. Charlie Wiles and Brad Cushing, Dr. David Gens, and the irrepressible Dr. Aurelio Rodriguez. At shock trauma, I would learn about the system of trauma care, a state that had really prided itself on support for its trauma care system, an approach to the academics of not only trauma care, but surgical critical care in advance of the name of acute care surgery. Also there, the irrepressible Dr. Rodriguez would assign us nicknames. He called me George Jefferson, and he called our assigned leader, administrative leader of the 6 fellows, Dr. Dave Jacobs, he called him the elder. Dave was mature beyond his years, had great leadership style, and this would start a lifelong friendship between us and Dave and Roz Jacobs and their family. But also at shock trauma, and also something very important happened in 1989. I had the opportunity to attend this impactful conference. This is the inaugural conference, the inaugural meeting in 1989 at Duke, April 1989, of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. This photo grows more precious with each passing year. In the front row, you see Dr. David Saperstein. To your left, his right, Dr. Anya Aquari. The only woman in this photo is a relative of Dr. Aquari. 31 people, 30 men, 30 surgeons, no women surgeons in this photo, 1989. A few other people were at this meeting, not in this photo. Dr. Donovan was at this meeting. Dr. LaFalle was at this meeting. And John Norman, the great underappreciated academic surgeon of that century, published over 700 papers. A relationship with Denton Cooley led to a great cardiovascular journal during his time, and many people didn't appreciate he was one of the few blacks to head a majority institution in West Virginia. But I'm beating around the bush here because probably the most important thing that happened in 1989 was my marriage. My mother gave me the opportunity to choose as an 11-year-old which school I would go to when I took the 7th grade entry exam for Sidwell Friends in St. Albans. And I brought all the cogent analysis to that important life decision that you'd expect of an 11-year-old. I chose Sidwell because they had girls, not realizing that the woman I would marry, my wife of 34 years, would be coming into that school 1 year behind me, in our high school year. There's a lot that this photo says to me. My friend Andre Campbell suggested that you don't show the wife and son photo until a little while into the talk, because you start crying for the rest of the talk. People say, how'd the Scudder go? And the fool cried during the whole thing. Michael and Maggie, thank you for being my rock. There's a lot that I'm going to refer to about the extremes of the circumstance of life when you go and take care of a patient population who are disenfranchised and you come home to a house that's really a home. On the one extreme of these two parents of this young boy, I hope you guys get to meet him. He's a little bit bigger than this young child here. On one extreme, an acute care surgeon, on the other, a family medicine doc by training, then trains in complementary and alternative medicine. She's working to make sure that boy lives to be 200. He grew up eating pretty well during the week, but as he progressed through Pop Warner, one of the great things about Saturdays is Mike got to choose what we would eat after his football game. So I kind of look forward to Saturdays, Papa John and some chicken wings. But I'm going to use the particulars of this support that brings me here today to try to convince you about some special things about trauma care. Many of you have followed the course of our family through Christmas cards each year, and I'm anxious for you to see where we are today. SBAS has been perhaps the most impactful organization I've been affiliated with, not only for the access to academic advances in surgical care, but for the camaraderie, the fellowship, the support of residents and of colleagues. And you know most of these. This is the meeting in North Carolina. Dr. Anthony Myers is one of several people who have taken me under their wing, having had nothing to do with my training. And it's hard to enumerate the benefit of those. Right at the top of that list would be the first one of the founding members of SBAS and his first executive director, Dr. Claude Organ. Can you imagine having the opportunity when you go for a period of literally 10 years, as when I was secretary, when Dr. Organ was the executive director, speaking to him each month. We had many conversations, well, I call them conversations, I pretty much just listen. But Dr. Organ, imagine, would give me the explanation as though he needed to for why he was spending so much time in his mentoring and granting me his wisdom. He said, if I had died and your father had survived, I hope he would tell the things to my son Brian that I'm going to tell you. He would tell me about the importance to establish a line of investigation, that you're working on a paper all the time. You should be chopping down trees. He would say to me, now you trauma gurus, he called us, you trauma gurus have to figure out how you're going to apply these resources and where they're going to come from to take care of these patients. I didn't understand the question, let alone the answer. And when I would see Dr. Organ at each meeting, he had that mischievous gleam in his eye. He would shake my hand and he'd look at me and he'd say, you sure look well rested. Think about that. Think about our discipline. We have the only line of work where that's not a compliment. I was on call, Dr. Organ, the night before last. I got sleep on the plane. And he loved to push us that way. And he turned over the reins as the executive director to this, the most important, I call him a peer, that's using the word a little bit flexibly. The only thing I missed in life is I didn't have a big brother. Not really. Dr. L.D. Britt was really my big brother. I heard of Dr. Britt a few years before I met him. He preceded me at shock trauma in Maryland by about 4 or 5 years. I heard this was the brother who's going to go back to Virginia, be the first black governor of Virginia. I've been teasing him for 30 years. It said Doug Wilder beat him, but that's kind of hype when you talk about somebody's at the beginning of their career. And think about it, what a shame it would have been had he limited his skill and his impact to one state. Thank you, Dr. Britt, for all that you've been in my career and for many countless other people who have come up along with me. But I don't want to make it too sugar-coated. There was a lot of positive energy around my career at that time. I was anxious to begin my academic career. But a senior surgeon who's not alive anymore, who I'll leave nameless because there's no need to drag his name to the mud, gave me the first of 3 quotes I'm going to share with you today that I bring up to this Scudder Oration. The first was, trauma is not a very academic discipline. Kind of hurt my feelings. I thought when I was going into an academic discipline, I was learning from these giants in academic surgery, and I was about to take my first job. Imagine coming home to your first academic job in the hospital that was the successor, the hospital where you were born. My father and Dr. LaFall, who hired me out of fellowship, marched into membership in the college in October of 1962 together. And I would join the ultimate, the quintessential academic surgeon. Working for Dr. LaFall is an honor that just is difficult to describe. After about 4 years, Dr. LaFall put a very difficult decision before me. He said, I want you to be the chief of the Division of General Surgery. And at the week before that conversation took place, I got a call from USC, my institution where I trained as a resident. Dr. Tom DeMeester was the chair, and Dr. Dimitri Dimitriadis had come from a hospital even busier, Baragwanath Hospital in South Africa, and put together a large trauma system, dedicated trauma system. Up to that time, each of our services took care of all acute surgical emergencies. And here we would establish a team that would take what I consider an academic approach to outcomes of our critically injured patients. Thank you, Dr. Dimitriadis, Dr. Byrne, who's the late, great Dr. Byrne, whose support of me, and Dr. Stephen Stain, who was a year behind me in residency, has a lot to do with our career to this day. Avi Rifkin, George Velma-Host, William Shoemaker, David Handpeter, Dr. Juan Asensio and James Murray, and my friend Howard Bellsberg, all a team that made that once-a-week research meeting just a thrilling thing to undertake. The exchange of those meetings and the productivity that grew out of it was something that is a big part of why I'm here today. About 10 years after Donald Trunke started to measure outcomes at these places that we would come to know as trauma centers, the same sort of study took place at LA County Hospital and earned this headline in the Los Angeles Times from this paper, comparing with the cohort of historical controls the outcomes of critically injured patients when we have a dedicated trauma service with both educational and peer review processes, in-house trauma faculty, and daily morning rounds so that we immediately assess what we do. That's a yardstick of critical care. That's what trauma care is. And despite all of these things, I think you have to say it's a yardstick for equal care, but it's also a challenge because the academic exchange that took place when we published this would be one of the exhilarating things in my career. 309 selectively managed patients with gunshot wounds to the abdomen. Those patients now managed under the care of senior surgeons, chief residents, in-house serial exams, and of those 309 patients, had we operated on them with the same indications that we did simply 10 years earlier, we'd have had a greater than 30% non-therapeutic laparotomy rate. I remember Dr. Britt once in a college meeting would challenge this. It has the pendulum swung too far. He said, Dr. Cornwell is in the audience. I'd like him to explain to me. And I'm in the back of the room, hello, 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 hello. Pendulum didn't swing too far, did it? Think about what we did today. That academic exchange is what benefited my career. Studies like that, studies like this, a patient who 1 month earlier had sustained a left thoracoabdominal stab wound, in and out of the hospital with the chest tube in 3 days, and then develops a, let's call it a tension viscerothorax. Those diaphragmatic fibers attenuate and become enlarged, erode, and over a period of time, the stomach pops into the left chest, pushing the mediastinum the other way. This patient had an easy operation to reduce his delayed diaphragmatic hernia, but didn't survive his seizure and cardiac arrest that was brought on by this. An academic approach to studying those patients prospectively, anywhere from 1 month to 27 years after the original stab wound, suggests that about 25% of stable patients who didn't need anything more than a chest tube will have on exploration in this area, the left thoracoabdominal region, will have a diaphragmatic hernia. And now in the age of minimally invasive surgery, we actually make the argument that it's acceptable to apply laparoscopy, look at the diaphragm when there's no other diagnostic test of reliability, and accept the 75% non-therapeutic laparoscopy to avoid the specter of these patients coming back anywhere from 1 month to 27 years later with the diaphragmatic hernia. That academic approach to that now deceased senior professor allowed me to think this is something that can actually change how we manage patients. And when we publish it and submit it and discuss it, we have an institution that we think is going to earn the support of the policymakers and the funders in perpetuity. Maggie calls this the angry black man slide. This is the response to a public health official's public suggestion that closing this county hospital, this largest hospital in the largest county of the country, would be the 9th largest state, LA County, a place of 12 million votes at the time, by the way. Those who gathered with us on the steps of the hospital to say, I think I'm in my hand, the literature states that the outcomes would be worse if we don't have, but the largest outcry came from those community hospitals that were ill-equipped to sustain the rigors of taking a large volume of patients for which they weren't ready to handle. And so that experience at LA County gave me an appreciation for the trauma systems as well as busy trauma service. And I was recruited to Johns Hopkins by Dr. John Cameron, who had explored my father for his unresectable pancreatic cancer in 1983. I was inherited by Dr. Julie Freischlag. I was a little nervous when I went to Hopkins. The U.S. News and World Report said this is the #1 hospital in America. Can you imagine? The one area to be developed is the trauma service in the poorest neighborhood in Maryland. It's hard to get any better than #1 U.S. News and World Report. So I held my breath and got in and out in 10 years. And for all 10 years, they were #1. So you can't blame me once they come down to #2. Dr. Cameron and Dr. Freischlag both provided the support needed for a division that will recruit superstars. They tell me that Harvard does that, recruit great people, then take credit for them. That's what I did. Thank you, Dave Efron, who's gone on to become the Tom Scalia Surgeon-in-Chief at my alma mater, shock trauma. Thank you, Elliot Hout, who has taken a study of venous thromboembolic disease. We tried to make the Hout Index, DVT over PE, by an aggressive surveillance measure. A PhD, the past president of East, and thank you, Otto Hader, who has trained the research fellows at my subsequent institution, who has gone on to lead here in Boston, the Center for Surgery and Public Health, and now is the dean at Aga Khan. You could have an Aga Khan alumni meeting in the Department of Surgery at Howard University, and you'd have some of our top residents. Thank you, Preeti John, Dave Chang, Glenn Roseborough, all people that are part of this process. Trauma as a yardstick for better care, equal care in America. Patients did better when we applied the enhancements of a dedicated trauma service, critically injured patients. That's a yardstick for equal care. We started to get the college's imprimatur verification. At the School of Public Health, there's a person a lot more famous than me, Ellen McKenzie. They gave me an appointment at the school because of the work I had done with Amin Ramsey and the previous in the trauma system of Maryland. I've had medical students ask me at this point in my career if there's anything I would do different if I could do it again, and I usually say maybe I would have gotten a master's of public health. I could have been somebody. But instead, I worked with these great students in public health, and now the examination of the benefits of trauma centers are starting to become irrefutable. But the one area where we didn't show a dramatic difference, frankly, the area that I thought we would show a great difference, given my experience with gunshot wounds, was these patients with these brazen injuries. Dave Efron has written at that time and again about the particularly brazen nature of these gunshot wounds in Baltimore, the 13th largest city in the country at the change of the century, but the largest that did not enjoy that decrease in penetrating injuries going from the early 90s to the late 90s. This is 5 patients in 1 week on the trauma service, all 5 20-year-old males, 3 of them dead on arrival from multiple gunshot wounds. Elliot and I both had patients with ER thoracotomies, 1 for a gunshot wound to the heart and 1 for a stab wound to the main pulmonary artery. That led to violence prevention initiatives, that things take place at Hopkins. Dr. Cameron said, rightly or wrongly, the spotlight shines brightly here, and the cameras will start to pursue the initiatives that you start to pursue, and so it was on the Hopkins magazine. This photo, arms across, it was about 35 degrees that day, sunny and cold as hell, just 2 blocks from the hospital. And this picture would pop up again, but it would lead to the initiatives of ABC cameras following us around and giving publicity to our pursuit. But always on my mind was the disparity between what I saw at work and what I saw at home. Every job I had up until the point where I was recruited back to home to Howard, I thought prepared me for that job at that time. The Department of Surgery is 140 years old almost at that time, with this photo taken just a few months after I got home. And this is, and you can't make this up, this is the entirety of the surgical department leadership for my life until I became the chair. Dr. Burke Syphax, seated there, became chair in the Department of Surgery in 1957, about a month after my own birth. He's the chair from 1957 to 1970. Dr. LaFall, on your left, my right, was chair for a quarter century, starting out as the chair and interim dean for 25 years, and on my right, your left, Dr. Clive Callender, who started the Transplant Center at Howard, and long before the term outcome disparities became sexy, they would start to describe the disparate incidences and outcomes of patients developing cancer and those who are in need of organs. And so the organizing theme of my chairmanship was to pursue clinical and academic excellence around surgical diseases where outcome disparities exist. What a blessing it is to also have, as the president of the university and as the senior vice president for academic affairs, Dr. LaFall and his mentee, Dr. Wayne Frederick, a surgical oncologist. The 3 of us would co-author Dr. LaFall's final book on education exemplars and excellence, a sesquicentennial Howard University publication, and I would recruit Dr. Mallory Williams. We would continue our verification streak, another 3, throughout his 3 deployments, a work ethic that is simply unmatched. Throughout his 3 deployments, continue verification of the Howard University Level 1 Trauma Center and an impact in our community beyond just the walls of our institution. The Clive Callender Outcomes Research Center is probably one of the most important things we've done to help the careers of students, residents, and faculty. Dr. Otto Hader, again, has mentored most of the research fellows in this institution. Thank you, Della Tagapour, Gezer Ortega, Tolu Oyatunji have gone on to great things in surgery. Turhas Weldeslassie is in our center now and is in the audience. Dr. Austin Akinyemi and Siobhan Arome all have become very productive for an outcomes research center that is going to pursue a new discussion when I close this talk. The legacy is in good hands. In that first FSPAS photo, Dr. Stain and I were sitting on that top row in our last years of training, about to enter an academic surgical career. No women surgeon in that photo. Dr. Stain and I would both then be succeeded by Drs. K. Marie Reed and Dr. Andrea Hayes Dixon, the first and second African-American female chairs of departments of surgery in this country's history. Dr. Hayes is now our dean, and now Dr. Terrence Fulham, sitting here, my first recruit as a chair who has established centers of excellence in bariatric at 3 different institutions, and along with Dr. Britt has established a diverse surgeons initiative to diversify the workforce in minimally invasive surgery. He's now our chair of Department of Surgery. That earlier photo I showed you with myself, Dr. Syphax, Dr. Callender, Dr. LaFall, was the first time in the department's history at that time, 140 years, where we've had 4 living chairs. Now we're back at it again with Drs. Callender, Hayes, Dixon, and Fulham, 4 living chairs. And consider this photo. This one has become even more precious than that first one. 27 years later, FSPAS brings folks together, by the way. We met at Michigan last month. This is Ohio State. We met at Duke, we met at North Carolina, so we bring all the rivals together. And here you can see in this photo, people moving down that aisle, some of the former presidents of Society of Black Academic Surgeons. You see Patricia Turner in the front, our executive director here, was the first president of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. And we see people moving down that row. And two of my favorite all-time surgeons tells us something about gender diversity in surgery. Both Karen Butler and Deborah Ford, who were both in this photo, operated with me in my first year as an attending in their final trimester of pregnancy. I say about gender diversity what I said about racial diversity. If it's about guilt of white males or quotas, never going to work, never going to have legs, but it's a positive thing to help us negotiate all the challenges that come to leaders, such as how do we get that balance for women who are seeking a career in surgery and how we work around their desire to start a family, their research interests. That's why we have had great opportunities and already great production for some of our residents who decide they want to pursue a career in academic surgery. And everything we do in the department, we do as a family. Residents are my favorite people. There's a nobility about them. Trying to work to get under 80 hours, they're by my side when some of the uglier things happen. A patient last month, mouth bloodied up when he picked a fight in a drunk in a fire department and got beat up. And now the police brought him in handcuffed, and I walked in the room and he spit on me. Something vile about spit, something in our history about spit. And when I stepped forward, one of my favorite residents said, Dr. Cornwell, but I know Dr. LaFaw would not be very proud if the headline says trauma surgeon slaps the hell out of patient. He was actually handcuffed to a gurney, both hands. I told the officer, I think I could have taken him, I should stop fighting if I can't take him. But these lighter moments in a discipline that's not for everybody, these lighter moments, I would argue to you, give us the opportunities to display our character. Now, when the residents see that my then 13-year-old son is making fun of me from that photo that went viral from his class, they decide it's okay for them to do the same thing. And so with each passing year, they're all deciding. Now, some are a little more dignified, but they all come together. It's a family affair at our institutions. And so many of them have seen this photo. Something happened when Michael turned 13. Maggie and I started to shrink. You all have cataloged this through Christmas cards over the year. And then something happened that was a little striking. The second of the quotes I want to bring to you. It's even in two professional families, it's frequently the mom that decides where you go to church. And one day when I was on call one Sunday, Michael said to Maggie, Dad doesn't always go to church. Now, I'm the guy that talks about role modeling, two parents in a home, the problems for penetrating injuries. That's a big one. Now, parents, you can't go to the mat so many times, but there was a bulletin board in Mike's room. This is one of the 2 times I wrote a letter to my son. I'm going to share it with you. It was kind of theological based, Dr. Fulham. I said, now, I think God will understand if I'm doing his work in the hospital outside of the walls of the church. I think God will see that as furthering our desire to have the world be a better place. Now, I don't know if an 8-year-old is going to totally buy that, so I had to get a little practical with some of the arguments by taking a lot of Sunday call as the chair. The Sunday of a 3-day weekend, perfect example. You see what's coming from Saturday, you see what you're passing on to Monday. I think that's a argument to be made to a young son. Now, I hope he would buy that if I said, now, by taking that Sunday call, Mike, I didn't miss many Saturday events. Your Pop Warner football, your basketball, middle school, high school, college. Despite the fact that you have some of the best hands of any high school receiver I've ever seen, the biggest play of your career was that Gilman game. We were about to lose 14-7. You were depressed your sophomore year when we lost to Gilman. You were elated your junior year, and this senior year, we're about to go down to defeat 14-7. You beat the quarterback and the tailback to that fumble as a defensive end. A fumble recovery, probably the biggest play of your career, led to a tie. And there it is in the background, a 21-14 overtime win, your last game. That took place on a Saturday, Mike. Couldn't have done it if I was taking Collins in. I'm trying to make the argument. College. Remember the Texas game, Maryland at Texas? This is in Austin. There you are. Television caught you. That took place on a Saturday. I was on call, flew home, was on call the next day. You graduate from Maryland, you have a year of eligibility, come to Howard during my sabbatical year. all-conference tight end. This is just a few miles from here, Mike. That's in the back of the end zone against Harvard. One-hand catch in the back. That took place on a Saturday, Mike. It wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have missed all these great moments, memorable moments of a lifetime, had I not to end senior day. Senior day at Howard, 35 seconds left. You catch a game-winning pass to beat Morgan State. That took place on a Saturday, Mike. Now, you can't pull the wool over God's eyes. God might say to me, okay, smart guy, how come the Sundays you take are always the one when the Redskins or Commanders are out of town or on a bye? And so I think he deserves a more complete answer. And Mike, before hundreds of our closest friends, I'm going to give it to you today. Dear Michael, you all can listen in. This thing called trauma, I'll admit it, it's got some addictive qualities for people that are truly committed. It is the barometer, the yardstick. It is the vehicle for equal care in America. Mike was only 7 years old when President Reagan died in 2004, and the post-mortem could confuse a 7-year-old. It showed about when he got shot, and Michael said to me, someone killed President Reagan? I said, oh, no, he survived that gunshot wound. He would go on to live another more than 20 years. And he said, well, did you operate on him when he got shot? As most 7-year-olds think their father operates on all trauma patients. And I said, no, it was another trauma surgeon, Dr. Gens and Columbani, who would later train and be a colleague of mine. There's another trauma surgeon that operated on him, Mike. Imagine something special that we, even our lay people, even our patients understand about trauma care. President Reagan, politics aside, politically gifted, self-deprecating humor, would come at you in the weirdest times. A 69-year-old man initially pushed in the back of the limousine when he was first shot, and people ascribe that pain in his left chest to hitting the floorboard of the limousine. He coughs, has a little hemoptysis, a little spot of blood on his chest. There's a smoker that took place at Howard. I was studying at the time, March 31st, 1981, when that took place. Of course, he would survive, but we had a smoker at Howard. The limousine was going back to the White House on 16th Street, GW Hospital, where my father trained, where Reagan went, 22nd, 23rd Street, Howard, Georgia Avenue, 7th Street. He's kind of equidistant. And so we had this skit. Am I being recorded? We had this skit about what if Ronald Reagan came to Howard, now with the controversy of Charles Drew, the great researcher about blood, and got black blood. And the first photo would be our white classmate sitting down. He's the president. After he gets his blood transfusion, then me and Jimmy Strudwick jumping around and doing all sorts of dances. Now that comedy aside, President Reagan walked in. He wasn't on a gurney. He walked into the entrance of GW Hospital joking. Well, I hope you're Republicans, he said. The president made a joke because, of course, politics aside, when it comes to trauma care, the barometer of your care, the way you're measured is how you take care of all people. And so when I told Mike, no, I didn't operate on the president on that day, Mike also had some identification of the importance. If you had operated on him, we'd be rich and famous. Hurt my feelings, but something, a 69-year-old president, a 7-year-old boy, both have something that's understanding is special about this trauma care, the barometer for equal care, taking care of you no matter who you are, where you come from. In May, Mike and I went down to Memphis. We walked from our hotel to the Lorraine Motel, where is now a Civil Rights Museum, where Martin Luther King was killed. He lay on that balcony, and that famous photo pointing, Jesse Jackson's in that photo, pointing to where that rifle blast came from, the boarding room across the home. You can stand in that boarding room now and look out that window 273 feet away. The bathroom is walled off, but where James Earl Ray had stood, moved some furniture and took aim at Dr. King. His injury blasted open his jaw. The subclavian artery in his first branch, the vertebral, were bleeding into his chest. His spinal cord severed at C7, T1. He would have been quadriplegic had he survived. And most people know that night, it's not all about being a good dad. The Lakers were in town playing Memphis in the playoff series, so that's why we had to go and make it. And Dr. King talked about, of all forms of inequality, healthcare is the biggest injustice. Let me shine a spotlight on Louis Wright, on my Mount Rushmore of great black academic surgeons coming in that generation out of slavery and leading to the numbers that we see today. Louis Wright, along with Daniel Hale Williams, Charles Drew, and his mentee, Asa Yancey, born in Georgia. 1891, to a former slave. His father died at the age of 4. His mother remarries the first black graduate of Yale Medical School. There were occasional blacks in the late 1800s and first quarter of this century who would train in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. I often say in another talk that he had a Booker T. Washington background, but a W.E.B. Du Bois sort of temperament. He was only 15 years old when his stepfather only had 2 rifles, gave him one when whites were rioting through the neighborhood, just kind of indiscriminately shooting blacks. And he told his 15-year-old son, I'm going to be around the back where they're trying to come in the house. If anyone comes up the front, you kill him. What an instruction to a 15-year-old boy at that time and that place in our history. But he encouraged his stepson, his outstanding student, to his academic excellence, outstanding career at Clark College in Atlanta. And then he encouraged his son to apply to Harvard. And he got into Harvard. But when he arrived, they thought there was a mistake. They thought his transcript was from Worcester, Clark University in Worcester. A cantankerous biochemistry professor on the spot examined Louis Wright. He passed with flying colors, and he would graduate from Howard. But back as consistent in that time, even those few blacks who trained in places other than Howard and Meharry would not train at that affiliate hospital. They weren't going to have them give orders to white nurses and care for white women. And so Louis Wright would come down to Freedman's Hospital, where I was born, and get some of his training there, write the first paper of an intern to dispel the myth that the Schick test for diphtheria immunity didn't work on dark skin. There's no photo, I think, that we'll see in the medical history of America. This is Harlem Hospital, integrated staff. He was the first black on staff. Several whites resigned when he did. He becomes the chief of surgery. White and black physicians in the 1940s at the bedside in a predominantly majority institution from the staff, and the black man is the boss. He would lead a surgical residency. They'd have a great experience in thoracic and cardiac surgery. This is fair-skinned doctors, the first African-American female thoracic surgeon, Mara Logan at Harlem Hospital, and they would establish a legacy of studying what they did. The early antibiotic studies, cancer chemotherapy studies, and management of penetrating injuries of the chest, well developed. These 2 outstanding residents. Dr. Wright was succeeded by Aubrey Maynard, who would become the chief of surgical services. And the year Dr. Wright died, this paper came out of Harlem Hospital, report of 81 cases of penetrating wounds to the heart, co-authored by 2 outstandingly trained surgeons, Dr. John Cordes in the middle, black, an NYU grad, trained at Harlem Hospital, Emile Naclerio, an Italian immigrant, went to Marquette Medical School at the time, trained there in thoracic surgery. And so they would be there on staff on that day in 1958 when Isola Curry, a deranged black woman who heard voices, told her to stab Dr. Martin Luther King. She went into her pocketbook to reach for a gun. She tried to shoot him as well. Dr. King sat motionless as they tended to him. And when she was subdued, they took Dr. King to Harlem Hospital. They couldn't find Dr. Maynard. He was in a movie at the time. At his bedside, this is not any 29-year-old black man stabbed on a Saturday in Harlem. Averell Harriman, the governor in a re-election race, would come to his bedside. The 2 trainees, thoracic surgeons, took Dr. King. They waited for Dr. Maynard to arrive, gave him the opportunity to put a coker on the knife blade and withdraw it from the chest. Dr. Maynard would later tell the story of the difficulty in the management and left some details out. The barometer of care, the public nature of that care at Harlem Hospital in the legacy of Louis Wright was something that allowed Dr. King to survive. And while many people consider that the premise for, some people consider his second greatest speech, I think his most profound speech was not the speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, August 28, 1963, but that speech he made in Memphis, April 3rd, 1968, a premonition that might be his last day in life. He'd gotten a letter from a young white girl that said, following up the information that Dr. Maynard said, had you sneezed, you would have stabbed your aorta and you would have exsanguinated. That would be the end of you. And Dr. King got that letter saying, Dear Dr. King, I'm so glad you didn't sneeze. And of course, in the style of Southern Baptist preacher, Dr. King himself said, I too am glad I didn't sneeze. And it led to his talk about longevity being important. Like anyone, I would like to live a long life. But he said, if I had only sneezed, I wouldn't have been around in 1960 to stand up and to go to the bus counters. If I had only sneezed. He talked about the fact that he had been to the mountaintop and that he's not worried. A 39-year-old man with 4 young children was one of the people that exemplified what these centers, these institutions dedicated to trauma care, the public impact that they would have, the public viewing. It would be well into the 2000s after Dr. Maynard died when Dr. Cordes described the true nature of those stab wounds in the management of Dr. King. Many people know of Dr. Charles Drew and his mantra of excellence in performance, transcending artificial barriers created by man. This famous photo of Dr. Drew with his residents and some of his faculty has him looking across the room towards that tall man against the wall on your left, Dr. O.W. Hoffler, who would be a hero of Dr. Britz. When he went back to Eastern Virginia to have his surgical practice, Dr. Drew dedicated to his residents. He would become a posthumous member of the American College of Surgeons, but his last day of life was put together by Dr. LaFall, his medical student, rounds on operation, and he gave a lecture to the sophomore class. That's March 31st, 1950, so that's the class of 52. Sitting in the front row would be the #1 student in that class. Lunch business, 2 meetings that night, student council banquet, a nursing sorority, rounds late night at the hospital, and then he, another faculty member, 2 residents are heading to the John Andrews Clinic. This amazing integrated meeting down in Tuskegee at the institute where his former trainee, Dr. Asa Yancey, had a surgical residency training surgeons of color. In 1950, there was no interstate system, so 4 black travelers, 2 residents in the back seat. Dr. Drew ultimately driving. This is not the 1949 Buick Roadmaster, but this is the seating arrangement when Dr. Drew was at the wheel and Samuel Bullock was the owner of the car, faculty, colleague. When Dr. Drew fell asleep, reverberated in recovery, Dr. John Ford remembers it. I interviewed him in 1954. The car correcting turned over. Most of the bulk of the impact was taken to Dr. Drew on his head and his chest. The other 3 occupants all survived. Dr. Ford had a humerus fracture. They were brought to this segregated hospital in Alamance County where blacks and whites came into the emergency department. If you were admitted, you were admitted to segregating ward. And 34 years after Dr. Drew's death, a nurse anesthetist would come talk to Dr. LaFall about that fateful night. And Dr. LaFall recounted it in a talk I want to share with you.
Going there, I found out that when Dr. Drew was brought in, that they knew that he was coming. But I should mention this, because when I was there was a lady who was a nurse anesthetist, Miss Lucille Crabtree. She was not there when I went down there in April. And she said, but Dr. LaFall, I'm coming up next month with my son, his wife, and my grandson. I'll be happy to talk with you then. So if I can jump to that, that lets you know what happened then. She said, we only ran 1 room on Saturday. And I had a patient on the table. I was getting ready to give my patient some Pentothal. And then I was going to put in a tube for the operation we were going to do. They called from downstairs and said there's been a very bad accident out by Haw River. They're bringing in some patients. One of them is critically injured. And she said, I am so glad I hadn't given my patient on the operating room table some Pentothal, because I could not leave a patient whose life I have placed in jeopardy by giving him some Pentothal, something that decreases respirations, and go to a patient whose life is in jeopardy. But I hadn't given anything. So she said, I put my endotracheal tube and my laryngoscope in my pocket. I ran downstairs, and when Dr. Drew came in, I was downstairs waiting along with other people who were there. She described this to me. She said that his pupils were dilated, both. There was blood coming from his ears. He had a crush wound of his chest and an avulsion wound of his thigh. And she said he was breathing in a very shallow manner, very shallow. And she said he was in deep shock and his blood pressure was in the low numbers, and she thought it was in the range of the 60s. And I'm going to mention something about his record in a moment. So she said then what she did, she got an endotracheal tube, the laryngoscope, put the endotracheal tube in, and she said, Dr. LaFall, we were all sitting there, she said, I, not a bragging I, not a bragging eye, but a sincere, thoughtful, genuine eye. She said, I was with him from the time he arrived until the time he died. I put the endotracheal tube in. I gave him IV fluids. Not that I was the only one there. Other people were there too, but we cared genuinely about him. And we were thinking about transferring him to Duke, only because Duke is a university. Alamance General Hospital is a little hospital. But we didn't have the time to get him to his condition not allow us to transfer him to Duke. I then asked her, did he get any plasma or blood? And she said, he did receive plasma, but they didn't have blood then. She said, Dr. Falk, we were a little hospital. We didn't have blood at that time, and by the time blood was available, he was dead. And I often mention this when I tell that story. I am so glad that I was sitting down, because to look into this woman's eyes, to know she was telling the truth, you just felt it. You knew she was telling the truth. And to hear what she had to say, I got weak in the knees. Just sitting down, I got weak in the knees, so I'm glad I was sitting down. We wanted to save this man's life if we could. And I believed her. I still believe her. And going there...
I still believe her. 34 years, coming out of the Jim Crow South, this woman comes to Dr. LaFall to say, we did everything we could, and I still believe her. The barometer for equal care is what trauma is. And finally, in my institution at Johns Hopkins, a story I frequently tell is when President Bush visited us. He wanted to talk about a drug prescription plan he was pushing. The White House advance team, since he was going to be right there at Hopkins, wanted to talk to the trauma chief, look at the ICUs, blood bank, nurse, where would the media go, where would the patient go. President Bush gave that talk. I was scored a ticket to be in the audience and was on call that day and a Friday afternoon, and minutes after he left, after being obsessed over everything going smoothly, the pager goes off, gunshot wound to the flank, and you know, your mind plays tricks on you. Could it be? No, don't let it be. What was a 15-year-old kid from East Baltimore? A gunshot wound to the flank, a renal artery injury. I took out his kidney. President Bush would have had the same surgeon, anesthesiologist, OR, blood bank, ICU, nurse, as a 15-year-old from East Baltimore had. Had you asked me 20 plus years ago about there being demographic differences and outcomes of patients, I would have said, no, I would have told you that story. And yet, to my surprise, when we pursued in this academic discipline, shout out to John Files and others that helped to develop these trauma registries, a robust subset of 370,000+ critically injured patients. I've introduced all the other authors of this. Marie Crandall, a skilled outcomes researcher, establishes amongst critically injured patients, going from white to black to Hispanic, insured to uninsured, a progressively greater relative risk of death. And when you look at those confidence intervals, the non-overlapping confidence intervals, for example, a black insured patient has an 8 to 33% chance, 95% confidence interval, of dying, greater percent chance of dying compared to his white insured counterpart, but a better survival than his white uninsured counterpart. And subsequent papers that we have published will identify insurance status as the single most prognostic predictive factor for survival among critically injured patients. Trauma care should be the actual vehicle. It should be the area where we study the benefits of insurance. We believe, if we call it the protoplasm theory, that when you're insured, you have a primary care doctor, you fill prescriptions, you know your blood pressure, your lipid profile, your hemoglobin A1C, all the things you bring to the table at night you're shot or stabbed or in a motor vehicle crash. But if that's true, as millions of Americans move from the insured to the uninsured to the insured, do they inherit the benefits? A study like this raises more questions than it answers. What about the issue of amongst insured and uninsured? Can you study racial, ethnic differences among a group where white, black, and Hispanic all have the same monolithic lifestyle, all are managed by the same protocols, all are treated as heroes? Despite all those positive factors, they're still at high risk for injury? The military. Sure enough, in some of the military databases, we see the race-based differences in non-traumatic acute care surgical conditions diminishing. And yet, this has nothing to do with access. We are rightly proud to state that a critically injured, uninsured patient gains access to our system every bit as quickly as their critically injured insured counterpart. And so I think it makes the case that this should be the vehicle for studying all the benefits of insurance. It's a vehicle for equal care. You might say, well, the uninsured have more penetrating trauma. Okay, the penetrating uninsured and interaction analysis, the blunt uninsured compared to their insured counterparts have still a severely different outcome. And finally, when we look at their actuarial survival, we don't, the oncologists do this. Pancreatic cancer out to 2 years, colon cancer out to 5 years, breast cancer out to 10 years. In trauma, if you're still around at 14 days, we kind of get a little tired of you. But here's an example of minorities do worse on the first day, suggesting something in the pre-hospital setting. But it stays fairly parallel out to 14 days. Women do better. Shout out to Bill Chaffee, Urshad Chowdhury, and Kirby Bland as they established in rats a hormonal basis for superiority and survival of females subjected to experimental hemorrhage. Women do better. Doesn't open up much more. The most distracting and disturbing slide that I have in any slide that I give is the dramatic differences in insurance from day one that grows still worse. Next steps, perhaps we can look at those states that accepted the Medicaid expansion. A state like Kentucky that benefited the most, demographics that took the uninsured from about 18% to about 6%, and compare it with Georgia that didn't accept it. 17% still uninsured rate. And then look at expected to observe ratios. We now have the ability to do that with databases, comparing each state to itself with the other state. And that allows us to look at trauma care as the vehicle for equal care. If we're going to approach disparities in outcomes, a fruitful first step would be to approach disparities in insurance access. And I would suggest in my closing remarks that our next step should be, we've got to the point when we consider gun deaths in America, we should not say it so broadly. It's like saying cancer. Is it a basal cell? Is it a pancreatic cancer? When we say gun deaths in America, ask your friends if they look at an article like this in 2018. Gun deaths reached the highest rate in nearly 40 years. Well, the absolute number of 39,000 had reached the same. The rate was lower. There were about 45 million more Americans. And what most people don't know outside of trauma care, and even some surgeons, is that suicides have always been higher. For the entire term, the CDC has measured this. C. Everett Koop's last year, Surgeon General 88 into early 89, he called homicide, which you see at that year, almost touched suicide, a public health epidemic. Well, suicide has now exceeded that, so it certainly is a public health epidemic. Different demographics. By gun, suicide in black women is extremely rare, and yet even as we see shifts, homicide has never quite reached it. There's still a disparity. The dialogue around preventive activities hopefully can be less distractive as we pursue lifting the muzzle on research to make it such that guns will be owned and used by people who can use them, maybe perhaps like your cell phone, so that during that period of lethal risks, that final step may not be taken. The Committee on Trauma has addressed it. West has addressed it. We're going to address it in our next annual meeting to talk about what can be done when we look at suicide by guns and homicide by guns at different diseases. And I close with this slide that my friend Mallory Williams gave me. We're both fans of inspirational Baptist, Southern Baptist preachers. And he used it in a talk, and I say to you that in this honor that you've bestowed upon me, more people than I know who've supported me, I'm sure, and more than you know, my appreciation. I think we all are pursuing the same thing for our trainees, for our students, and for our patients. I've mentioned many people here today who are no longer alive, whose impact, I call them my heroes, have affected my career and by extension those of those who I helped to train. And so I think about this slide when I think about my family, my son, when I think about those who we train. Is our life going to have impact long after we have been gone? Will the footprint still be there? This will help us pursue what I think is the second most important day of your life, not only the day that you're born, but the day that we understand why we were born. All of us are bonded by that special pursuit of taking care under difficult circumstances in the public eye, our most critically injured and some disenfranchised patients. I celebrate you for participating in it, and I thank you for giving this extreme honor to me and my family, the opportunity to give the Scudder Oration. Thank you very much.
Dr. Cornwell, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and incredible contribution to the legacy of the Scudder Oration. Thank you. Also, thank you for your leadership, your dedication, and contributions to the trauma patient. On behalf of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, I'd like to present you with this framed certificate which commemorates you as the 2023 Scudder Orator. Thank you.